Is the Levitical prohibition of male same-sex intercourse all about male domination over women? Does it differ from what we see elsewhere in the ancient world? And why do I say that Dan McClellan's argument about Leviticus and lesbianism is the most convoluted that I have ever heard? Stick around for answers to all these questions. Hi, my name is Robert Gagnon. I'm a visiting scholar of the Bible at Wesley Biblical Seminary in Ridgeland, Mississippi. I've published extensively on the Bible and homosexuality in scholarly works, including a 500-page book on the subject. This is part 3 of my series responding to Dan McClellan's video, quote, my final response to Robert Gagnon, which was McClellan's response to my video, is Dan McClellan right that ancient Israel accepted lesbianism? McClellan argued that I had straw-manned his view on Leviticus and lesbianism and wildly misrepresented him. I issued a 2-part response to McClellan. Part 1, Dan McClellan's argument on Leviticus and lesbianism is the most convoluted I have ever heard. And Part 2, does Dan McClellan know the difference between empirical fact and contention? There I pointed out McClellan's ongoing contradictions about Leviticus and lesbianism, showing that McClellan was gaslighting his fan base and talking out of 2 sides of his mouth. I adduced 5 lines of evidence that prove that McClellan was indeed making, as he himself put it, a contention.
My contention is that these prohibitions are only relevant to male Jewish people,
not just stating an empirical fact.
Doesn't condemn, which is an observation of an empirical fact,
for which he even cited Leviticus expert Jacob Milgram in support.
Jacob Milgram agrees with me that these passages in Leviticus 18 and 20 are limited only to male same-sex intercourse. This raises one of my big concerns with Gagnon's attempt to assert the universality of this morality.
His contention was that the authors of Leviticus 18 and 20 did not reject female same-sex intercourse in any way, not even implicitly, that they simply didn't care whether female Israelites engaged in same-sex intercourse, despite denying now that he had ever previously indicated that the authors of Leviticus 18 and 20 would have had no problem with female same-sex intercourse. McClellan continued to contradict himself in his response, maintaining that
the notion that female same-sex intercourse is implicit in Leviticus 18 and 20 is not true.
And that we cannot
extend the scope of that prohibition
of male same-sex intercourse in Leviticus 18:22 and 20:13 to
apply to female same-sex intercourse.
He also offered not a single reason himself for conceding that
they probably would have rejected it as well,
with McClellan denying all the historical reasons that I gave for why Leviticus 18:22 and 20:13 implied a prohibition of female same-sex intercourse. In short, with his final response, his argument about Leviticus and lesbianism is more convoluted than ever. In my prior response, I not only made these points, looking at the whole of his response, but also addressed in seriatim his statement that he made in the first 2 minutes of his response. I will now do the same for the rest of his video, omitting some of McClellan's repetitions that I have already dealt with. Note that McClellan begins each of his responses with playing a clip from my video, Is Dan McClellan right that ancient Israel accepted lesbianism? In order for you to understand the context for his statements, it's necessary for me to include those excerpts from my own video. Dan McClellan thinks, along with a few other scholars, like Jacob Milgram, Saul Olyan, that ancient Israel did not have a problem with woman-female intercourse.
Again, this is a straw man. What we all note is that the legislation never condemns it.
This is a manifestly false statement, a blatant misrepresentation. As we have seen, the Leviticus expert Jacob Milgram not only notes that the Levitical legislation never explicitly condemns female same-sex intercourse. That's a nothing burger, because every scholar notes that obvious and undeniable fact, but also concludes from this absence that it is permitted. And as we have noted, McClellan even cited Milgram at this point as being in agreement with his contention.
Jacob Milgram agrees with me that these passages in Leviticus 18 and 20 are limited only to male same-sex intercourse. And this raises one of my big concerns with Gagnon's attempt to assert the universality of this morality.
In his book chapter, McClellan leans significantly for his view of the Levitical prohibitions of man-male intercourse on Old Testament scholar Saul Olien from Brown University, from his 1994 article in the History of Sexuality entitled The Meaning and Significance of Leviticus 18:22 and 2013. Olien suggests that lesbian intercourse went unmentioned because it was, quote, unthreatening to the purity of the land, there being no commingling of two otherwise polluting substances in the body of the receptive partner, unquote, in other words, through anal intercourse, as with man-male intercourse. Olien implies then that it was permitted, not rejected. So it's clear that McClellan is not being honest about what Milgram and Olien also believed, and what McClellan too was arguing in agreement with them. He is hiding the truth because he knows that his contention, namely that Leviticus 18 and 20 are not
universally condemning any and all homosexual practice,
requires the intermediate premise that lesbian intercourse is permitted, not rejected.
We have not concluded that that means they had no problem with it.
But again, Milgram and Olien did conclude that, and your own conclusion requires it. I would recommend a logic course.
What I have said in the past is that likely they didn't think it was as big a deal, precisely because of the rationales for condemning male same-sex intercourse.
Later in his response, at the 16-minute mark, McClellan adds,
in other places, in print and on social media where I've talked about this, I have said that they probably didn't think it was as big a deal, but they probably still wouldn't have been okay with it.
I'd like McClellan to show where he said this previously. It is not mentioned in his only published work on the Bible and homosexuality, that is, in the one chapter in his recent book. And if he did say it previously, he clearly didn't logically integrate it then or now with his conclusion that the authors of Leviticus 18 and 20 did not universally condemn any and all homosexual practice. It is a very important concession. So why didn't he note it in 95 minutes of prior video response to me? Unless it was because he didn't want to be seen as arguing against himself.
Toward the end of Gagnon's video, he actually agrees with me.
That's cute, Dan. If we agree on anything, it's you agreeing with me. When I suggest in my 2001 book, The Bible and Homosexual Practice, that, quote, the primacy of penetration for defining sexual intercourse may partly explain why the Holiness Code leaves out lesbian relationships, unquote. Bear in mind, Dan, that I wrote this long before you even received an undergraduate degree. Moreover, unlike you, I recognize that this explanation does not justify the conclusion, which you erroneously adopt, that the authors of Leviticus 18 and 20 did not universally condemn any and all homosexual practice.
The condemnation of male same-sex intercourse in Leviticus 18 and 20 does not constitute a condemnation of female same-sex intercourse in Leviticus 18 and Leviticus 20.
But you have already admitted that they do condemn lesbian intercourse by claiming that the authors of Leviticus 18 and 20
probably would have rejected it as well.
How do you know that they probably would have rejected it? If you are not getting that from the moral logic of the prohibition of male same-sex intercourse, where are you getting it? Again, your remark is as nonsensical as saying about the absence of explicit incest prohibitions of sex with one's daughter or full sister. Quote, the condemnation of incest with a granddaughter, daughter-in-law, half-sister, sister-in-law, and stepsister does not constitute a condemnation of sex with a daughter or full sister in Leviticus 18 and 20, unquote.
So you cannot point to Leviticus 18 and Leviticus 20 as a universal condemnation of all homosexual practice. That is, by far and away, the most likely interpretation of the data.
Wrong again, Dan. for reasons already stated. If you acknowledge that the authors of Leviticus 18 and 20
probably would have rejected it as well,
then they obviously did condemn female same-sex intercourse along with male same-sex intercourse. Your conclusion is absolutely precluded by the concession you have newly divulged to me. You are gaslighting. Again, it's the equivalent of saying, absurdly, that I cannot point to Leviticus 18 and 20 as a universal condemnation of incest with one's child or sibling. Even Milgram would disagree with you as regards incest. There is something else that I want you to note here as an addendum. Remember that elsewhere in the same video, McClellan had claimed that when he says that Leviticus 18 and 20, quote, do not condemn female same-sex intercourse, unquote, and so, quote, do not universally condemn homosexual practice. He is just stating an empirical fact.
saying doesn't condemn, which is an observation of an empirical fact.
Now he calls this just the most likely interpretation of the data.
So you cannot point to Leviticus 18 and Leviticus 20 as a universal condemnation of all homosexual practice. That is by far and away the most likely interpretation of the data.
Which means that he can't be referring to the fact that Leviticus 18 and 20 do not contain an explicit prohibition of female same-sex intercourse, because that's not an interpretation, but an empirical fact. It is the same confusion that he perpetrated when he stated,
My contention is that these prohibitions are only relevant to male Jewish people.
a contention is not an empirical fact. An interpretation is not an empirical fact. Yet he uses empirical fact and contention and interpretation for the same assertion. McClellan is either logic challenged or gaslighting his fan base. He wants his fan base to think both that Leviticus 18 and 20 offer no support for a moral rejection of lesbian intercourse, and that I straw-manned and wildly misrepresented McClellan when I said that McClellan doesn't think that the authors of Leviticus 18 and 20 had any problem with female same-sex intercourse. He can't have it both ways. Either one, my assertion about what he was saying is correct, or two, his conclusion that Leviticus 18 and 20 don't condemn in any way female same-sex intercourse, not even by implication, is false. 4 lines of evidence strongly indicate that we should read the prohibitions of man-male intercourse as prohibitions of same-sex intercourse generally. The 4 lines of evidence are, number 1, the moral logic of the prohibitions of man-male sex. Number 2, the historical context of ancient Israel. Number 3, the later Greco-Roman view of lesbianism. And number 4, the history of interpretation of these prohibitions in early Judaism and Christianity. First, their moral logic. These prohibitions of man-male intercourse imply a prohibition of woman-female intercourse on the same principle by which man-male intercourse is forbidden. If it is wrong for a male to play the role of a female in an act of sexual intercourse with a man, then it would be wrong for a woman to play the sexual role of a man in an act of sexual intercourse with a female. For God created woman as the sexual counterpart to a man, not to another woman.
So, as I pointed out in my previous video, what Gagnon likes to do is impose generalizing and unifying logical frameworks onto these questions to try to extrapolate more general principles from these specific pieces of legislation.
Now I like to bring to bear the closest ancient parallels to a given text in order to illuminate its meaning, which is the standard way of understanding ancient texts. Let me introduce you to what responsible scholars do, which is different from what you are doing here. Namely, you are imposing here a generalizing and unifying dismantling framework onto biblical texts, a narrow reductionism that seeks to reduce every biblical text on homosexuality to an exercise in misogyny to keep women down, in spite of the fact that there are clear ancient parallels that look to design complementarity of the sexes. Something obvious not just to us, well, not obvious to you, Dan, who, as Paul states, has suppressed the transparent truth, but obvious to us and also to the ancients in terms of anatomy and physiology.
And so here the idea is, because it's wrong for a male to have intercourse with another male, it must therefore be wrong for a female to have intercourse with another female. There is parity, there is reciprocity. What is wrong for the man must be wrong for the woman because they are sexual counterparts to each other.
Although McClellan is about to reject this claim, I say yes. We do see this parity in other priestly material, notably Genesis 1, 26-28, where God creates, quote, male and female as a sexual pair, whose bodies are reproductively designed by God as complementary sexual counterparts with a capacity to procreate. In Genesis 1:27, this male and female complementarity, unlike that of animals, intersects with being made in God's image and likeness, as a way of saying that to mess with this design complementarity is to commit sacrilege against the Creator who designed you. Genesis 1, 26-28 doesn't even say anything about the male ruling over the female. It was obvious to the priestly authors of Genesis 1 and to the priestly authors of Leviticus 18 and 20 that male and female are the only true sexual counterparts, and that for a male to be in a sexual relationship with another male or a female with a female is to deny their Creator-given creation as each only one half of a whole sexual spectrum.
And of course, there's a reason that male same-sex intercourse is being condemned, and Gagnon is going to acknowledge that reason later on in this video.
Except McClellan only heard the part he wanted to hear, about men playing the active/dominant role and women the passive/subordinate role. And he didn't hear the part that I said that is confirmed in ancient texts that doesn't suit his reductionism, namely male-female anatomical and physiological complementarity. Even Old Testament scholar Saul Oljan, on whom McClellan heavily depends, admits a, quote, sex-bound difference between ancient Israel and early Judaism on the one hand, and the ancient Near East and the Greco-Roman world on the other. I will give now a somewhat lengthy block quote from Oljan. According to Oljan, the Middle Assyrian laws, like the Hittite laws, and, quote, like the evidence from Athens and Rome, differs from Leviticus 18:22 and 20:13, which prescribe male-male couplings without qualification. The general prescription of male-male intercourse in Leviticus 18:22 and 20:13 is striking in light of the evidence from Athens, Rome, and the Middle Assyrian laws. In the classical cultural context, status plays a significant part in determining licit and illicit couplings between males. In the Middle Assyrian laws, status, coercion, and repeated acts of receptivity appear to play a part in constructing the boundaries between sanctioned and prohibited behaviors among men. In contrast, Leviticus 18:22 and 20:13 ban all male couplings involving anal penetration, seemingly those coerced and those voluntary, those with men of higher status, equal status, or lower status, those with men of one's community or another community, unquote. Thus, different from both the ancient Near East and the Greco-Roman world, male homosexual practice is rejected in Leviticus absolutely on the basis of same-sexness, irrespective of the status of the receptive partner, his community affiliation, his age, or his willingness.
And it's because men are at the pinnacle of the hierarchy of domination that became socially conventionalized in ancient West Asia. And so for a male to be sexually penetrated violated their position in that hierarchy.
A perfect example of McClellan's reductionism that reduces everything to male dominance over women, which he must do given the stipulations of LGBTQ dogma to which McClellan is enslaved. This dogma requires that the biblical text be discounted as relevant for today's homosexual relationships. In ancient societies that made hierarchy the primary concern, they found ways to accommodate at least some forms of homosexual practice, since hierarchical subordination exists within the male sex. Nearly all males are subordinate in status to other males in society. But in ancient Israel, early Judaism, and early Christianity, where the central concern was not male dominance, but rather design complementarity, where the sexual design of male and female bodies makes clear that the only sexual counterparts are male and female, no accommodation is made to homosexual practice. By the way, in the Greco-Roman world, as a sort of women's liberation movement develops in the early Roman imperial period, we find the case for the superiority of male-female love over male-male love being strengthened, the exact opposite of what one would predict from McClellan's generalizing reductionistic model, where opposition to homosexual practice is viewed solely as a reinforcement of male dominance over women.
So is there reciprocity there?
There is reciprocity when one recognizes the concerns in ancient Israel for design complementarity, so self-evident in the priestly text of Genesis 1, the nearest parallel to the priestly prohibitions of man-male intercourse in Leviticus 18:22 and 20:13, besides the prohibition of male and female cross-dressing in Deuteronomy 22:5. McClellan intentionally ignores the closest parallels because his LGBTQ dogmatism, not the biblical data, requires him to do so.
If it's inappropriate for a man to be sexually penetrated, does that mean their sexual counterpart cannot be sexually penetrated? Of course not, because they're not on equal footing.
Who is arguing that a woman, man's sexual counterpart, cannot be sexually penetrated? But not primarily for the reason that McClellan gives. Being on unequal footing as regards a social hierarchy doesn't change the central fact that the woman is designed anatomically and physiologically for sexual penetration in an act of sexual intercourse. McClellan is picking up the expression sexual counterpart from me, used of a woman in relation to a man. It raises the question, could McClellan be so foolish as to think that the sexual counterpart to a man is another male, or to a woman another female? These are sexual sames, obviously, not sexual counterparts, where what is missing in one sex is not brought to completion in the other sex.
The man is the superior in the sexual relationship. He's the only active sexual agent. The woman is not an active sexual agent. They are a passive sexual partner.
Well, I hope that I don't have to explain to McClellan the mechanics of sex, where a man alone is equipped with the proper organ for penetration, and a woman alone with the proper organ for reception of the male organ. So there is an active/passive dynamic built into natural male-female structures. But in both the ancient Near East and in the later Greco-Roman world, as we have seen, when sex is first and foremost about status differentiation and dominance, various forms of male homosexual practice can be accommodated because males in various ways are societally subordinated to other males. But in ancient Israel, early Judaism, and early Christianity, sex is not first and foremost about status differentiation and dominance, but rather about sexual differentiation, underscoring once more McClellan's dogmatic reductionism.
So the notion that what's wrong for a man is therefore wrong for a woman because there is complete reciprocity and parity and they are counterparts to each other, and so A equals B, therefore B equals A, is falsified. Not only because they're not equals, but because we have in the Bible quite clear indications that men have vastly distinct responsibilities, duties, rights, expectations, limits to their sexual activity.
I've never said that men and women don't have different sets of expectations and responsibilities. So what? Remember that McClellan is using this as an argument to deny that the moral logic in ancient Israel behind rejecting male homosexual practice speaks to the reason for rejecting female homosexual practice. Namely, if it is wrong for a male to play the role of a female in an act of sexual intercourse with a man, then it would be wrong for a woman to play the sexual role of a man in an act of sexual intercourse with a female. For God created woman as the sexual counterpart to a man, not to another woman. McClellan's opposition to this moral logic is ironic, for it works even on a male dominant/female subordination model. Woman-female intercourse can be viewed as wrong because typically in the ancient world, as often still today, one female is in the active/dominant position, playing the more masculinized or butch role, even when no penetration is involved, though a prosthesis for the male member could also be used. The moral logic that I noted coming out of Leviticus 18:22 and 20:13 is even more confirmed for ancient Israel relative to its ancient Near Eastern environment, and later for early Judaism relative to its Greco-Roman environment. For alone in ancient Israel, as also later in early Judaism and early Christianity, the sex of the participants is a more defining feature of opposition to homosexual practice than is the concern for dominance/submission. If McClellan wants to reject a moral logic for rejecting female same-sex intercourse that is based on the moral logic for rejecting male same-sex intercourse, on what basis, then, does he believe that the authors of Leviticus 18 and 20
probably would have rejected it?
He doesn't offer any explanation anywhere in his video. So is he asserting that they probably would have rejected lesbian intercourse for no reason at all? That's ridiculous. It seems that he is adopting the adage of the Groucho Marx song,
Don't know what they have to say, it makes no difference anyway, whatever it is, I'm against it. No matter what it is or who commenced it, I'm against it.
for no other reason than being dogmatic. He is certainly not acting like an historian.
So, as he does generally, Gagnon is just imposing a generalizing, unifying, logical framework on the text in order to get it to say what it doesn't say, in order to twist it so that it can be made to say what Gagnon wants it to say, despite the fact that it does not say that.
Again, this is a clear case of projection. All the twisting is on McClellan's part, as he completely ignores the closest ancient parallels in Genesis 1:26-28, and, next point, Deuteronomy 22:5, ignoring also the differences with the rest of the ancient Near East, in favor of a reductionistic dogma that he has to impose on the biblical text from his LGBTQ ideology, a dogma that reduces everything in the Bible to male superiority and female inferiority so that he can discount the biblical witness against homosexual practice for today's homosexual relationships. And again, he has offered no reason whatsoever for now conceding that the authors of Leviticus 18 and 20
Probably would have rejected
female same-sex intercourse.